The Dark Scrolls. The winter night was thick with the scent of smoke and wax, when a child's cry pierced the stillness of the palace at Toledo. Candles flickered in their iron sconces, shadows crawling across the stone walls as midwives murmured prayers under their breath. Isabella of Castile, the queen whose will had already bent half a kingdom into obedience, lay exhausted, while Ferdinand of Aragon stood nearby with the solemn pride of a monarch who knew that every child born under his roof carried the weight of dynasties. The baby was named Joanna, and though she was not firstborn, her destiny would carve itself deeper into Europe than any of her siblings. Those who watched her baptism whispered that a strange gravity lingered in the air, as if unseen hands had already begun weaving the threads of her fate. Spain in the late 15th century was not yet the Spain we recognize in the maps of later centuries. It was still fragile, stitched together by Isabella's Castile and Ferdinand's Aragon, a unio of crowns rather than a seamless kingdom. Their marriage had been a gamble, a fusion of ambition and necessity. And it had worked. The Reconquista had driven the Moors from Granada in 1492, and banners bearing the cross of Christ had been planted atop Alhambra's towers. The Inquisition burned with merciless intensity, purging heresy in the name of unity. The voyage of Columbus, sanctioned by Isabella's resolute faith, had opened a door across the ocean into lands unimagined. It was an age of triumph, of destiny unfolding. And within this crucible, Joanna grew, a child not of peace, but of purpose. Her childhood was one of rigor. Isabella believed her daughters should be educated with the same ferocity as sons, for queens might rule if God decreed it. Joanna was drilled in Latin until her tongue ached, pressed to memorize the Psalms until they echoed in her dreams, instructed in music, dance, and the arts of diplomacy. She absorbed philosophy, theology, even the harsher doctrines of Thomas Aquinas. Her mind was sharp, disciplined, but restless. The courtiers noticed her intensity, the way her dark eyes seemed to pierce through masks and pleasantries. She played the harp with elegance, sang with a voice that priests claimed could still the heart, and moved with the bearing of a girl destined not for obscurity, but for history's stage. Yet shadows accompanied her. The Castilian court was no place of laughter and childhood games. It was a theater of power, where every gesture was calculated, every smile weighed, every prayer a performance. From her earliest years, Joanna understood she was not her own. Her body, her hand, her very breath would be a bargaining chip. When emissaries visited from other kingdoms, she was displayed with pride, another jewel in the Catholic monarch's crown. She learned that her destiny was not to choose, but to be chosen. Rumors of prophecy clung to her cradle. Some whispered that an old friar had foretold her life, that she would give birth to kings and emperors but would never wield the crown herself, that her blood would stretch across Europe, while she herself was bound in silence. Superstition or invention, it haunted her reputation. A child marked not by innocence, but by omen. As she grew, the fortunes of her family expanded. Her elder sister, Isabella, was sent to Portugal to seal that alliance. Her brother Juan, beloved as the hope of the dynasty, was prepared as Prince of Asturias. Her younger sister Catherine would eventually be promised to the Tudor heir of England. And Joanna? She was to be the bridge to Burgundy, Austria, and the sprawling dominions of the Habsburgs. Her parents, pragmatic as ever, saw her not as a fragile daughter, but as the hinge of Europe. Through her, Spain could anchor itself to the most powerful house of the continent. At 16, her fate was sealed. A marriage was arranged with Philip, Duke of Burgundy, son of Maximilian of Austria, heir to the Habsburg legacy. Philip was known already as Le Beau, the handsome. Golden-haired, broad-shouldered, with the charisma of a prince raised among splendor, he was the prize of Europe's dynastic game. Maximilian sought to expand Habsburg influence, to wrap his line around every throne it could reach. Isabella and Ferdinand saw in Philip the perfect match: strength abroad, security at home, and the promise of grandchildren who would tie together realms from Spain to the Low Countries, from Austria to beyond the Alps. The betrothal was celebrated with pomp, though Joanna herself remained curiously silent in the chronicles. Did she dream of love? Did she dread leaving Spain? History does not grant us her thoughts. We only know that the decision was not hers. It was the will of her parents, the strategy of her lineage. A princess was not a person. She was a treaty, a seal upon parchment, a bridge between crowns. In 1496, Joanna departed Spain. The fleet that bore her northward carried more than jewels and finery. It carried the ambitions of kingdoms. The voyage was cursed from the beginning. Storms rose with ferocity, tossing the ships like toys, waves towering over the decks as sailors cried to saints for mercy. The wind howled through rigging like a chorus of demons. Some muttered that the sea itself resisted this union, that heaven warned against it. But Joanna endured, pale and sick but unbroken, until at last the fleet staggered into the harbors of the Low Countries. The land she entered was nothing like the sunlit courts of Castile. The climate was gray, the air damp, the people foreign in tongue and custom. Yet when she met Philip, whatever doubts she had were drowned in sudden flame. Chroniclers tell us their attraction was immediate, overwhelming. Unlike many arranged marriages where cold formality reigned, this one ignited with passion. They were inseparable in those first weeks, their nights consumed by desire so intense that courtiers whispered in shock. It seemed for a moment that fate had granted her more than duty. She had found love, but the light of that flame was blinding, and its heat devouring. Philip was as faithless as he was charming. Adoration from others fed his vanity, and he pursued other women openly, heedless of scandal. Joanna, raised in the stern morality of Spain, was undone by these betrayals. Her devotion curdled into jealousy, her jealousy into obsession. She clung to him with desperate intensity, fearing abandonment, demanding fidelity he would not give. To the courtiers of Burgundy, her passion appeared excessive, unseemly. They began to whisper that the Castilian princess was unstable, that her love was not love, but madness. Whether she was truly unbalanced or merely wounded by betrayal, the narrative began to form. La Loca, they called her, the Mad One, a name easy to attach, impossible to remove. Philip himself saw advantage in it. If his wife could be branded irrational, then his authority over her inheritance, became secure. A queen diminished is a husband empowered. And so, slowly, Joanna's reputation was shaped not by her own deeds, but by the stories told around her. Even in these early years, she began to feel the tightening chains of destiny. She bore her first children, one after another, each arrival hailed not as personal joy, but as political triumph. Eleanor, Charles, Isabella, heirs not only of Spain, but of Habsburg ambition. Her body became a battlefield of dynasties, her womb the forge of empires. With every birth she fulfilled her role, yet with every birth she lost a fragment of herself. For she was not celebrated as a mother, but used as a vessel. The Spanish court watched from afar, Isabella and Ferdinand anxiously reading reports. Their daughter was fulfilling her duty, yes, but at what cost? Her behavior disturbed them. Stories of her jealous rages, her quarrels with Philip's mistresses, her sleepless wanderings at night reached their ears. Isabella the Catholic, stern and unyielding, worried not only for her daughter's soul, but for the stability of Castile's future. For if Joanna was unstable, what would become of the crown she was destined to inherit? The tension between Spain and Burgundy simmered beneath the surface. Philip wanted more power, more independence from Ferdinand's grip. Joanna was caught in the middle, both bridge and battleground between two worlds. She tried to hold her place, to secure her husband's affection, to prove her worth as queen-to-be. But the more she struggled, the more the narrative of her madness grew. And once a reputation becomes convenient for powerful men, it becomes nearly impossible to escape. Still, in these first years abroad, she was not yet the prisoner she would become. She was young, passionate, full of fire. She still believed she might bend destiny to her will, still believed Philip's love might be reclaimed, still believed her role as daughter of Spain and Duchess of Burgundy might lead to triumph. The storms had not yet broken her completely, but they gathered, dark clouds forming on the horizon. As she stood on foreign soil, watching Philip smile to other women, clutching her firstborn children with trembling hands, Joanna must have felt both exalted and abandoned. She was at the center of Europe's grand design, yet alone in her own heart. She was both queen and pawn, both wife and widow in waiting. And though she could not know it, the road she had begun would end not in triumph, but in shadows deeper than any she could imagine. The years ahead would test her beyond endurance. They would strip her of husband, of freedom, of voice. They would leave her name shrouded in whispers of madness, even as her children ascended to crowns across the continent. The girl who had been raised under candlelight in Toledo, taught to sing and pray, was now entangled in a destiny that would consume her utterly. And as the bells of Burgundy rang in celebration of her children's births, the tolling was also for her own unraveling. What began in passion would end in silence. What began in love would end in chains. The journey from Spain to Flanders was not just a voyage across seas. It was the first step into captivity, a captivity that would define the rest of her life. The passion that had burned so fiercely in the early days of her marriage did not settle into harmony. It became a torment, a fever that consumed her. Philip was dazzling in appearance, yet faithless in spirit. He walked the courts of Flanders with golden hair gleaming, a smile always ready for other women, his charm a weapon that cut Joanna deeper with every betrayal. She, raised in the severe piety of Castile, had given her heart entirely to him, and what she received in return was humiliation. Her love twisted into obsession. Her jealousy became a fire too visible to hide. She wept, she raged, she begged. The courtiers watched and whispered, and soon the word madness began to attach itself to her name. She bore more children, each one a triumph or dynastic strategy, but a further shackle upon her spirit. Isabella, Ferdinand, Mary, Catherine. Each child's birth was recorded not as a personal joy, but as another stone laid in the foundations of empire. She was praised as Mother of A, yet no one asked after her heart. The Spanish court wrote reports back to Ferdinand and Isabella of her conduct, increasingly alarmed. Her mother feared for her daughter's health, but also for Castile's future. A queen whispered to be unstable could unravel all that had been built. Philip saw opportunity in her despair. The more her emotions slipped beyond control, the more he pressed the narrative that she was unfit to govern. For him, her supposed instability was a tool, one that allowed him to claim power in her stead. In his hands, love became manipulation, and her pain became his advantage. Even when she clung to him with desperate devotion, he turned away, leaving her abandoned amid hostile courtiers. She wandered the halls at night, her hair loose, her eyes blazing, searching for him, searching for faithfulness that would never come. The stories of these wanderings spread, embroidered with exaggeration, until the image of Juana as La Loca grew fixed in European imagination. Fate moved swiftly in the year 1504. In Spain, her formidable mother Isabella lay dying. The queen who had conquered Granada, who had united Spain under the Catholic monarchs, who had sponsored voyages across the ocean, knew her time was near. On her deathbed, she named Joanna as her heir to Castile. With those words, Joanna became Queen of Castile in law, though her father, Ferdinand, would attempt to hold the reins as long as he could. For Ferdinand, the idea of sharing power with Philip, whom he mistrusted deeply, was intolerable. Yet Philip had no intention of stepping aside. Through Joanna, he saw the crown of Castile within his grasp. And so, while Joanna mourned her mother, the men around her sharpened their knives of ambition. When news of Isabella's death reached Burgundy, Philip prepared to travel to Spain to claim his wife's inheritance. Joanna, still wrapped in grief, still desperate for her husband's elusive affection, accompanied him. The journey south was bitter. She arrived within Spain not as the cherished daughter returning home, but as the disputed queen, caught between her father and her husband. Her people greeted her with curiosity, with murmurs of pity, for already the reputation of her instability had preceded her. Yet she was their queen, crowned by right, and her name carried authority even as her voice faltered. The conflict between Ferdinand and Philip escalated. Both sought to govern Castile in Joanna's name, neither trusting the other. Joanna herself, grieving and torn, struggled to assert her will. Her words were ignored, her pleas twisted, her decisions doubted. She became the silent center of a storm, the queen upon whom crowns depended, yet the woman whom no one allowed to rule. The factions used her name like a banner, while dismissing her as incapable. It was a cruel paradox. She was indispensable, yet voiceless. Then, in 1506, destiny struck with a blow no one anticipated. Philip, only 28 years old, vibrant with life and arrogance, fell suddenly ill with fever. Some said it was typhoid, others whispered poison. Whatever the cause, his health collapsed swiftly, and he died within days. The man Joanna had loved with such destructive passion was gone. The bond that had bound her to hope, however fragile, snapped. Her grief was catastrophic. Chroniclers describe her clinging to his body, refusing to release him, insisting his coffin travel with her from place to place. Whether this is literal truth or a distortion spread by those eager to emphasize her madness, it became the defining image of her widowhood. The queen wandering with her dead husband, unable to let go. The courtiers recoiled, horrified or amused, and the whispers of La Loca grew louder. Her grief was presented not as human sorrow, but as proof of insanity. Yet consider her position. Betrayed in life, abandoned in love, now stripped of the only anchor she had clung to, surrounded by hostile forces who treated her as a pawn. Who would not unravel beneath such weight? Her despair was not irrational, it was human. But human pain was not convenient for the men who sought her crown. Madness was. Her father, Ferdinand, moved quickly to reclaim authority. With Philip dead, he returned to Castile, reasserting himself as regent. Joanna, though queen by right, was deemed unfit to govern. Her grief, her instability, her unwillingness to play the role of compliant monarch, all became reasons to silence her. And so, under the guise of protection, she was escorted to the palace convent of Tordesillas. There she was told she would be safe, cared for, watched over. In truth, she had entered her prison. The walls of Tordesillas rose pale against the Castilian sky. Cloisters and chapels intended for nuns and prayer. For Joanna, it became a tomb while she still lived. Her attendants were guards, her confessors spies. She was allowed little freedom, her children taken from her care. Charles, her eldest son, was raised in Flanders, groomed to inherit both Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. Her daughters were dispatched to marriages across Europe. One by one, the bonds of family were stripped away, leaving her alone in the corridors of her captivity. Her days sank into monotony. At times she prayed with fervor. At times she lapsed into silence, refusing food, refusing comfort. At other times she erupted in storms of anger or grief, frightening her attendants, who recorded every outburst as evidence of her madness. Yet some accounts suggest moments of lucidity, flashes of wit and intelligence, reminders that beneath the despair lived the brilliant woman once praised for her mind and her voice. It was easier, however, for her jailers to perpetuate the myth. A mad queen justified their rule. A lucid queen threatened it. Spain accepted the fiction. Ferdinand reigned until his death in 1516, after which her son Charles claimed the crown. Joanna remained queen in name, her signature still appearing on documents. But she had no voice in policy. She was a symbol, a justification, nothing more. Charles, raised far from her, saw her not as mother but as obstacle. He visited her briefly, found her unsettling, and ensured her confinement continued. Thus the Queen of Castile, rightful ruler by inheritance, lived as a ghost, while her son ruled the greatest empire in Europe. The years after Philip's death stretched into decades of shadow. Joanna aged within her prison, her hair silvering, her face lined with sorrow rather than ease. Her reputation as La Loca spread across Europe, cemented in chronicles, whispered in foreign courts. She became the mad Queen of Spain, a legend more than a person. And yet, though silenced, she was indispensable. For every Habsburg who ruled after her traced legitimacy through her. Her womb had birthed the emperors. Her blood had bound Spain to Austria, Burgundy, the Low Countries. She was erased as a ruler, but immortalized as a vessel. The paradox was bitter beyond words. Travelers who passed Tordesillas sometimes spoke of eerie sights. They claimed to glimpse her at windows, pale and veiled, muttering prayers or curses. Some said she still spoke to Philip, believing him alive, that she conversed with his ghost in the night. Whether these were inventions or truths distorted by fear, they strengthened the legend. Joanna was not merely a queen. She had become a specter haunting her own reign. Outside her prison, the empire flourished. Charles rose to become Holy Roman Emperor, uniting realms across Europe, ruling territories in the New World, commanding armies against Protestants and Ottomans alike. His power was unmatched, his name feared across Christendom. Yet every document bore the shadow of Joanna. She was still queen, still alive, still the root of his authority. Without her, his claim to Castile and Aragon weakened. Thus she lived, not because they cherished her, but because they needed her existence. She was too valuable to kill, too dangerous to free. The years blurred, but the sorrow never lifted. Joanna endured, trapped between life and legend, mother of kings yet prisoner of her own crown. Her story had twisted into tragedy, yet the empire she birthed soared across oceans and generations. She was no longer the young bride who had sailed into the storm, clinging to passion. She was the widow locked in silence, the queen erased, the mother whose children ruled the world while she walked the corridors of a convent alone. The palace convent at Tordesillas became the axis of her life, a place where the seasons changed, yet nothing changed at all. The Douro River shimmered beyond its walls, flowing endlessly, mocking her immobility. Days bled into years, years into decades, until time itself became a fog. The woman who had once crossed seas, who had once stood at the heart of dynastic alliances, was now reduced to the rhythm of confinement. She prayed when told, she ate when persuaded, she raged when grief overwhelmed her. Guards came and went, confessors rotated, attendants aged and died. Yet she remained, the immovable prisoner whose captivity outlasted them all. Her son Charles, meanwhile, grew into the most powerful ruler of his age. In 1519 he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor, adding the weight of ancient titles to the crowns of Spain, Burgundy, Naples, and beyond. His dominion stretched from the Americas to Austria, from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. Chroniclers proclaimed that the sun never set on his empire. Yet even at the height of his glory, the shadow of his mother lingered. For legally, she was still Queen of Castile. Documents continued to bear her name. Her presence justified his rule, even as her voice was silenced. Charles visited her at Tordesillas, but rarely and briefly. The encounters were formal, devoid of warmth. He had been raised far from her, taught to see her as unstable, dangerous, inconvenient. She was his mother, yet also his liability. He ensured her imprisonment endured, for releasing her would threaten the stability of his rule. Some factions within Spain still murmured that Joanna was the rightful monarch, that she had been wronged, that her son was an interloper, imposed by foreign tutors and foreign designs. To free her would risk rebellion. To kill her would risk damnation. So she was kept alive in silence. Visitors who saw her during these decades left conflicting accounts. Some described a woman broken beyond recognition, unkempt, muttering incoherently, refusing to bathe, refusing to eat, consumed by shadows. Others saw flashes of the keen mind she once displayed, moments when her wit cut through the fog, when her words revealed that she understood her plight all too well. Perhaps she played madness to protect herself. Perhaps despair truly consumed her. The truth is lost, buried beneath propaganda and silence. Her children became monarchs across Europe. Eleanor, her eldest daughter, married first the King of Portugal, then the King of France. Isabella wed the King of Denmark, though her marriage was fraught with turmoil. Mary married into Hungary and Bohemia, her fate tied to lands that would fall to Ottoman advance. Catherine became Queen of Portugal, her offspring binding Iberia closer. Through these daughters, Joanna's blood seeped into every corner of the continent. They carried her legacy even as they left her behind. None returned to free her. Their lives belonged to dynastic duty, not to maternal devotion. For near 50 years, Joanna lived as a paradox, central to Europe's fate, yet erased from Europe's stage. She was the queen-in-law, the ghost in practice. Every Habsburg claim to Spain traced through her veins, every crown balanced on her silence. She was indispensable, but unacknowledged. The world shifted outside her prison. Protestantism spread. Wars raged in Italy. Ships sailed back from the New World laden with silver. Empires rose and collided. But for her, every day was the same. A walk in the cloister, a whispered prayer, a scream in the night, a silence that stretched like chains. Legends grew around her. The people of Castile spoke of the queen who wandered at night, barefoot, pale, clutching rosaries. Some swore they saw her speaking to phantoms, calling to Philip as if he still lingered. Others said she cursed those who betrayed her, that storms rose when she wept. She became less a woman than a myth, a symbol of suffering and confinement. In villages beyond the convent walls, people, assassins, told tales of the queen imprisoned unjustly, her sorrow shaping the fate of Spain. Whether these stories were born of pity or fear, they ensured that Joanna's presence haunted the realm long after her voice was silenced. Charles, weighed by the burdens of empire, eventually abdicated. In 1556 he retreated to a monastery in Yuste, weary of constant wars, of the endless struggle against Protestant princes, of the ceaseless demands of ruling lands too vast to govern. He divided his inheritance. Spain, the Netherlands, and the New World went to his son Philip II, Austria and the imperial title to his brother Ferdinand. Even as he relinquished power, his mother still lived, confined in Tordesillas. He had outlived his reign, but she had outlived her freedom. In her final years, Joanna's body weakened. She had survived beyond expectation, her frame frail, her face marked by decades of sorrow. Attendants noted her long silences, her refusal to eat, her shrinking into herself. Sometime, she erupted in sudden fury, startling those around her. Sometimes she prayed with intensity, eyes burning with faith. At other times, she seemed distant, wandering between this world and another. Her life had narrowed to its last flickering ember. On April 12, 1555, after 75 years of life, Joanna of Castile died within the walls that had confined her for nearly half a century. The bells tolled across Tordesillas, not in triumph, but in release. The woman who had been born a princess of Spain, who had been crowned queen, who had been the bride of Burgundy and the mother of emperors, passed not on a throne, but in captivity. She was buried beside Philip, the man whose love had been her torment, whose death had been her undoing. Even in death she was bound to him, as if the chain of her life could never be broken. Her death closed a chapter, but did not end her presence, for in the veins of every Habsburg ruler who followed, her blood coursed. Charles V, Philip II, Ferdinand I, their children and grandchildren all carried her legacy. The Habsburg line dominated Europe for centuries, ruling not only Spain and Austria, but Hungary, the Netherlands, even parts of Italy and the New World. Their power seemed unshakable, their dominion vast. Yet within their triumph lay the seeds of decay, the deformities of inbreeding, the weight of endless wars, the burden of ambition stretched too far. Many saw this as the curse of Joanna. The madness whispered about in her became incarnate in the jaws and bloodlines of her descendants. In time, historians argued whether she was truly insane or merely slandered. Some saw her as a victim of grief, a woman undone by betrayal and loss. Others saw her as a victim of politics, silenced because her existence threatened the ambitions of the men around her. Perhaps both were true. She may have been fragile in spirit, yet her fragility was exploited until it became her prison. What cannot be denied is that her life was stolen from her. She was a queen who never reigned, a woman whose destiny was twisted into myth. The convent at Tordesillas still stands. Travelers wander its halls and feel the weight of silence, the echo of footsteps long gone. Some claim they sense her presence, a chill in the air, a whisper in the cloisters. They imagine her pacing still, barefoot on cold stone, whispering to herself, reaching for the children taken from her, for the husband whose coffin she clutched, for the freedom she never knew. Her ghost lingers not because she was mad, but because her suffering was too vast to vanish. She was the mother of empires. From her womb sprang kings, queens, emperors whose decisions shaped continents. The New World was claimed in the name of her descendants. Wars of religion tore Europe apart under their banners. Cities flourished and burned because of the thrones they sat upon. Yet the woman who made it possible spent her life in chains. She was indispensable, yet erased, exalted, yet discarded, alive, yet buried. Her story is not one of madness alone. It is the story of power built on silence, of crowns resting on suffering, of empires born from the womb of a woman denied her own voice. Joanna of Castile remains a haunting presence in history, a reminder that beneath every throne lies a cost, measured not in gold or land, but in lives diminished, in spirits broken. Her name, whispered as La Loca, should instead be remembered as Mother of Empires, Prisoner of Destiny. Even now, centuries later, when bells toll in Castile, when the Douro flows past Tordesillas, it is said her shadow stirs. The empire she birthed has long since fractured, yet the memory of its silent mother endures. In her story lies the eternal paradox of power, that those who shape history most profoundly may themselves be buried beneath it. Charles had become the most powerful ruler in Europe, and yet behind every proclamation, every decree stamped with his seal, the name of his mother lingered like a ghost. Her blood had given him legitimacy. Her silence had given him power. With Joanna locked in Tordesillas until her dying breath, Charles reigned unchallenged, his empire stretching farther than any in living memory. It was said that the sun never set on his dominions, for when night fell in Spain, The dawn already broke in Mexico or Peru, in the Philippines or across the waters of the Atlantic. His reign marked the true flowering of the Habsburg legacy born from Joanna's womb, a dynasty that now bound half of Christendom in its grip. His court glittered with splendor, but it was built on constant strain. Charles inherited more than thrones. He inherited endless wars. The Reformation tore through Germany, Protestant princes defying his Catholic crown. France, under Francis I, sought constantly to challenge him, clashing with Habsburg armies across the Alps and in the Low Countries. The Ottoman Empire pressed from the east, their fleets prowling the Mediterranean, their armies threatening Vienna itself. In every direction, enemies arose, and Charles spent his life riding from battlefield to battlefield, never at rest. He was emperor, but also a wanderer, pulled endlessly by the weight of an empire too vast for one man to hold. Yet even amid these struggles, the triumph of his lineage was undeniable. Through his sisters, Joanna's daughters, the web of Habsburg blood stretched further. Eleanor, married to Manuel I of Portugal, bore children who bound Spain and Portugal together, though later she would be sent to France as wife of Francis I. Isabella, married to Christian II of Denmark, carried the line into Scandinavia, though her husband's downfall cast her life into turmoil. Mary, married to Louis II of Hungary and Bohemia, stood at the edge of Christendom, where Ottoman armies would eventually engulf her kingdom, her widowhood leaving her to govern as regent in the Netherlands. Catherine, wed to John III of Portugal, strengthened ties across Iberia, her descendants entwining Spain and Portugal ever more tightly. Each daughter was a thread woven into Europe's fabric, binding kingdoms not through conquest but through marriage. Each carried with her the shadow of Joanna, the mother whose body had been the crucible of their dynastic fate. From her, the Habsburg web spread like roots beneath the soil of Christendom, unseen but inescapable. Charles himself embodied the paradox of this inheritance. He was brilliant, devout, determined, but he was also weary, haunted, stretched thin by responsibilities beyond human endurance. He confessed to feeling trapped within a destiny too immense, the chains of duty forged long before his birth. Those chains had been fastened by Joanna, though not of her own will. Her blood had bound him to Castile. Her womb had tied him to Spain. Without her, could not rule. Because of her, he bore the impossible burden of ruling everything. As decades passed, the signs of decline began to creep into the very blood that had brought such power. The Habsburgs, desperate to preserve their dominions, married again and again within their own family, tying cousins to cousins, siblings' children to one another. The result was consolidation of land and titles, but at a terrible biological cost. Jawlines grew heavy and distorted, tongues thickened, minds clouded. Generations later, when Charles II of Spain was born with deformities so severe that he could scarcely chew or speak, many whispered it was the curse of Joanna at last made flesh. Her madness, whether real or invented, had become the mark of the dynasty itself. But in the 16th century, that curse was only beginning. For now, the Habsburgs seemed invincible. Gold and silver poured from the New World, filling their treasuries, though also fueling inflation that would eventually hollow Spain's strength. Armies marched under their banners, fighting in Italy, in Germany, in the Netherlands. The Inquisition burned heretics in Spain, preserving unity through terror. Across the Atlantic, conquistadors toppled the empires of the Aztec and the Inca, planting the Habsburg flag upon pyramids and temples. All of it was claimed in the name of Charles and his heirs, but beneath it all lay Joanna's silent legacy. Even in her death in 1555, her presence had not faded. Charles himself abdicated the following year, retreating to a monastery in Yuste, exhausted and broken by decades of war. He left Spain and its vast overseas empire to his son, Philip II, and the imperial crown of Austria and Germany to his brother Ferdinand. Thus the Habsburg line split into two branches, Spanish and Austrian, each destined to shape the continent for centuries. Joanna, buried quietly in Granada beside Philip the Handsome, had given rise to both. Philip II, her grandson, carried forward her blood into Spain's most celebrated, yet most burdened age. Under his rule came the Armada, the golden age of empire, the flowering of art and architecture, but also the beginning of decline. The vastness of the dominion, the endless wars, the reliance on silver that bled away as quickly as it arrived, all these were the shadow side of the grandeur Joanna had enabled. The empire built on her blood began to rot from within, even as it reached outward to dominate the globe. Meanwhile, in Austria, Ferdinand and his descendants entrenched themselves as emperors of the Holy Roman Empire, holding Vienna against the Ottomans, governing a patchwork of German principalities, carrying the Habsburg name into Central Europe. They too carried the mark of Joanna. Though separated by geography, the Austrian and Spanish branches of the family never ceased to intermarry, binding themselves closer and closer until the genetic toll became undeniable. What had begun as a clever dynastic strategy turned into a slow strangulation of vitality. The image of Joanna haunted all of this. She had been locked away, silenced, diminished as a madwoman. Yet her blood flowed in every crown worn by her children and grandchildren. She was the mother of empires, though she never held the reins of one herself. Her captivity had been the condition of their freedom, her silence the foundation of their power. As stories of her circulated, they took on mythic qualities. Some painted her as truly insane, unable to govern, her grief over Philip consuming her reason. Others began to question, even within her own time, whether she had been the victim of manipulation, declared unfit not because she was mad, but because powerful men needed her silenced. To Ferdinand, to Philip, to Charles, her supposed madness was convenient, allowing them to reign unchallenged in her stead. History blurred the line between truth and slander, leaving her remembered not as she was, but as she was useful to be remembered. The people of Castile, however, whispered differently. For them, she was not merely La Loca, but the queen unjustly imprisoned, a woman robbed of her birthright, a soul who had suffered for the ambition of men. To peasants and villagers, her sorrow became a mirror of their own, her silence an emblem of the voiceless. Legends grew of her ghost wandering the corridors of Tordesillas long after her death, of her prayers echoing in the night, of her spirit cursing the dynasty that had confined her. Whether truth or myth, such stories ensured that Joanna remained not only a figure of history, but of haunting. By the 17th century, the fruits of her bloodline were clear. An empire stretched thin, rulers increasingly weakened by the very intermarriage that had once preserved their dominion. The Spanish Habsburgs staggered beneath the weight of their realm, their kings less capable, their treasuries strained, their armies overextended. The Austrian Habsburgs fared better, holding their position against the Ottomans and maintaining the imperial title, but even they bore the marks of decline. All of it traced back to Joanna, the silent queen whose life had been erased so that her descendants could reign. In her, we see the paradox of dynasty at its most extreme. She was both mother and prisoner, both foundation and forgotten. Her captivity allowed her children to flourish, yet her suffering planted the seeds of their downfall. Her blood bound Europe together, yet in that binding lay the curse of decay. And still, when we trace the crowns of Europe, Spain, Austria, Hungary, Portugal, the Netherlands, even the royal houses of France and England through marriage, we find her shadow. Her children and grandchildren sat on those thrones, shaping wars, treaties, alliances. The history of the 16th and 17th centuries is the history of Joanna's blood, carried outward by the children she bore in grief, raised apart from her, ruling in her absence. It is said that when Philip II gazed upon the Armada sailing to England in 1588, he invoked divine favor and the legacy of his forebears. Yet behind him stood not only Charles, not only Ferdinand, but Joanna. Silent, erased, forgotten, yet still the reason the crown sat upon his head. The ships that burned in the Channel, the soldiers who fought in Italy, the priests who thundered in the pulpits, all of it was part of her legacy. She had become inseparable from the destiny of Europe, though she had never been allowed to shape her own. The irony was complete. A woman dismissed as mad had birthed the empire upon which half the world turned. A queen imprisoned had become the matriarch of kings and emperors who ruled oceans. A widow silenced had become the root of power that would define centuries. And the curse of that power, the weight of endless wars, the deformities of blood, the decline of kingdoms, was hers as well. When Joanna's body was laid to rest beside Philip in Granada, the world moved on, yet her presence lingered like a shadow stretching across generations. Her son Charles had already abdicated. Her grandson Philip II now ruled Spain in her name, and her descendants in Austria held the imperial title she had unwittingly delivered into their hands. The woman silenced for half a century was gone, but the dynasty she had birthed roared like a storm across Europe. For a time it seemed invincible, the great Habsburg house encircling Christendom, crowned in both Madrid and Vienna, feared in Paris, envied in London, challenged in Istanbul. But already within the veins of her descendants, the curse whispered. Philip II inherited not only the crowns of Castile and Aragon, but also the vast New World territories, the Netherlands, Naples, and Milan. He married Mary Tudor of England, Joanna's own niece, briefly binding Spain and England together under one faith, one dynasty. For a moment, the Habsburg reach seemed endless, but Mary died childless, and with her death, the English crown slipped away. Philip turned his gaze elsewhere, determined to guard Catholicism against the rising tide of Protestantism. He sent the Great Armada against Elizabeth's England in 1588, confident in divine favor. The fleet burned, shattered by storms and English fire. It was the beginning of a long unraveling. In Austria, Ferdinand's line held the imperial throne, but their lands were a fragile mosaic of German states, forever quarreling, resisting central authority. The Ottomans pressed against Vienna, and though beaten back, the pressure never ceased. The Reformation split Christendom, and the Habsburgs found themselves forever at war, trying to hold together faith and empire with hands that grew weaker. As the 17th century unfolded, The cost of their dominance became clear. The treasure of the New World poured into Spain, silver from Potosi and Mexico flooding Europe. But the wealth poisoned, and more than it nourished. Inflation crippled Castile's economy. Peasants starved as prices soared, and the kingdom that had once conquered Granada now withered under the weight of its empire. Armies fought endlessly in the Netherlands, draining resources in a rebellion that never seemed to end. The 30 Years' War consumed Germany, with Habsburg armies battling Protestant coalitions across scorched fields. The glory that had sprung from Joanna's blood was being paid for in exhaustion, ruin, and despair. And through it all, the curse of the bloodline revealed itself in flesh. Generation after generation, the Habsburgs married within their own family, desperate to keep crowns united. The jaws lengthened, the faces warped, the bodies weakened. By the time Charles II of Spain was born in 1661, the dynasty had produced a king so deformed he was scarcely capable of speech, his tongue too swollen, his mind too clouded. He could not father children, he could not lead armies, he could barely hold himself upright. He became the symbol of the dynasty's decay, the very image of a throne collapsing under the weight of its own blood. The people whispered that it was Joanna's madness at last revealed, carried forward in the veins of her descendants, made visible in bone and flesh. Where once her name had been used to silence her, now it was invoked as a warning. She had been called La Loca, the Mad Queen, and the dynasty she bore had inherited both her crowns and her curse. It was as if her suffering, her captivity, her broken heart had seeped into the bloodline itself, poisoning it slowly across the centuries. In 1700, with the death of Charles II, the Spanish branch of the Habsburgs ended. He left no heirs, no strength, only a kingdom racked by weakness and debt. The War of Spanish Succession erupted, Europe tearing itself apart to decide who would inherit the vast but crumbling empire. The Austrian Habsburgs continued, but their dominance too would wane in time, their land challenged, their power fractured. The great house that Joanna had created reached its zenith, then dissolved into decline. Yet if her blood carried ruin, it also carried triumph. For centuries, Habsburg rulers shaped the destiny of Europe. They fought Turks and Protestants, governed Spain and Austria, sent conquistadors to the Americas, patronized art and architecture that still endures. The empire of Charles V, of Philip II, of Ferdinand, was real and immense, and all of it traced back to Joanna. She never sat upon a throne in power, but she created dynasties that sat upon every throne worth claiming. Even after their decline, the Habsburgs remained. Their name carried weight well into the modern age, their palaces still standing in Vienna and Madrid, their portraits staring down from gilded frames with jaws that bore the mark of their ancestry. Tourists wander the halls of El Escorial or Schönbrunn and marvel at the wealth, but the ghost of Joanna lingers there too. For she was he beginning, the woman who gave them everything while losing everything herself. Historians debate her endlessly. Was she truly insane? Was she merely crushed by grief? Or was she a victim of politics, silenced by men who found it convenient to brand her incapable? The evidence is uncertain, the records written by those who benefited from her silence. Perhaps she was fragile, vulnerable to despair. But fragility is not madness. And even if madness took her, it was made worse, not better, by the cruelty of confinement. The truth may never be known. What is known is that her life was stolen from her, and that theft gave birth to empire. The people of Castile remembered her differently from the chroniclers. To them, she was a woman wronged, a queen robbed of her crown, a mother robbed of her children. Folklore made her into a spectral figure, wandering the corridors of Tordesillas with rosary in hand, her whispers drifting through the night. Some claimed storms rose when she wept, that crops failed when her sorrow deepened, that Spain itself suffered because of her suffering. She became less history than haunting, a ghost not only of a woman, but of a kingdom that had overreached. And perhaps that is her true legacy, the reminder that behind every empire lies sacrifice, that behind every crown lies blood, that glory is purchased with silence. Joanna's silence lasted half a century, her voice stolen, her body imprisoned. Yet the empires she birthed rose and fell in her name. She was erased as a woman, but remembered as a womb. She was condemned as mad, but she was indispensable. She was forgotten in her time, yet unforgettable in history. The convent of Tordesillas still stands, its stones worn by centuries. Visitors say the halls feel heavy, the air thick with memory. Some swear they sense her presence, a chill in the cloisters, a shadow at the window. They imagine her still pacing, barefoot, whispering to Philip, to the children taken from her, to the God who never answered. She is not at rest because her story was never given justice. Her life is a parable of power, that thrones are not built only by warriors or kings, but also by the silent suffering of those denied their place. Joanna of Castile bore the greatest empire of her age in her womb, and in return was locked away until her death. Her curse was not madness, but the ambition of men who needed her silenced. And her ghost remains, not only in Tordesillas, not only in Spain, but in the history of Europe itself. When we speak of Charles V, of Philip II, of the glories and tragedies of the Habsburgs, we are speaking of her shadow. When we trace the wars of religion, the voyages across oceans, the rise and fall of empires, we are tracing her legacy. She was the mother of empires, prisoner of her own crown, the queen who never reigned, yet ruled everything through blood. And so, though centuries have passed, her story endures, not because she held power, but because she was denied it. Not because she was free, but because she was caged. Her silence shaped the fate of nations. Her suffering built dynasties. Her blood carved the destiny of Europe. Joanna of Castile, remembered as La Loca, remains instead the silent architect of an empire that once claimed the world. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.